My name is Jeffrey Meekins. I've recorded this because I posted on my Facebook account this morning that I was going to tell my God story at City Life Church, and there were some folks who responded that they might be interested in hearing this, and so if this helps you and it glorifies God, then I'm happy with that. I grew up in Borger, Texas, a little town northeast of Amarillo. Grew up as the son of a oil field worker and a stay-at-home mom part-time. Part of the time she was a beautician. Did some other things occasionally. Grew up with a sister 5.5 years younger than I am, mildly mentally retarded, uh, autistic. That was the house we lived in. Uh, I've always felt like for some reason as a kid growing up that I was pretty much less than. There were a couple of things that I did fairly well, but I was never really able to receive fully the praise for those things. Always felt like there was, something lacking. What I've come to understand is that I probably grew up for a significant portion of my childhood, maybe the whole thing, in one form or another of depression. Uh, Discovered music in sixth grade, started to come out of that a little bit with band. Discovered in eighth grade choir that I could sing some and that I was pretty decent at it, but still pretty much felt less than. Went off to Lubbock Christian College, met my wife Vicky there. My depression seemed to manifest itself in this anger, and the person that I was angriest at probably was myself. I was hard on myself, didn't forgive myself, couldn't really receive praise. But the person that I ended up getting taken out on was Vicky, and so there was the domestic violence and the abuse that started when we were dating, and it continued through the first 9 years of our marriage. Those were terrible years as I look back at them. They were just moth-eaten, lost years, living a lie, not understanding what was going on, seemingly powerless to stop this stuff. And I made my efforts, through my own self-will, and we eventually came to the spring of 1995, and I had been able to keep my anger down and managed and keep my hands off of her in anger for about a year. But then one weekend that came crashing down spectacularly. And I was just left wondering and grasping for straws about what to do and, and how to take care of things. And I remember looking at a book that she had around the house one day, a self-help book about these kinds of things. And there's a paragraph in there about the abuser confessing publicly. And she had written out in the margin, Jeff will never do this. And this is God, because that was the last thing I was really looking to do. But I read that and I just thought, is that really what I need to do? Okay, I'll go do it. And so I found myself at the front of our congregation one Sunday evening with this letter, saying that that I had abused my wife. And it was read, and I turned around at the end of the service and just looked back up the aisle, not really knowing what to expect, if I'd be loved or welcomed or rejected or scorned. And I looked up and I saw a brother coming down the aisle, a guy named Dan Killeber. And I'd known Dan for some years. I didn't know him well, but he was coming down the aisle toward me, and his heart was broken, and there were tears in his eyes. His heart was broken for my pain and my shame and my grief. And in that moment of need, I fell on grace. And the grace that I fell on was Dan and Teresa Killebrew, and Bo and Renee Reed, and David and Janice Vest, and Jay and Johnny Tripp. And those people held me up when I didn't deserve to be held up. And they loved me when I wasn't lovable. Uh, from there, I got a teaching job. I'd been underemployed for several years. I got offered a teaching job, began to teach elementary physical education, started to struggle mightily. The first year of teaching is really, really hard, and I struggled mightily. I ended up having to take a leave of absence. The depression came back. Uh, Life was falling apart again. Marriage was falling apart. Vicky was had picked a date and she was going to leave, and I was really struggling. And so I got into some counseling. I remember being in our apartment one day and reading this book, Happiness is a Choice by Menathan Meyer. And there in the pages of that book, I began to understand that I would never be any happier than to the extent that I could put my faith in the promises of Jesus Christ. And I had been in church for all my life, and somehow that had never really been made clear to me. And from there, things started to look up. Vicky came in a few days, or she left me a note after she went to work a few days later. She said, I don't know what it is, but I just don't feel any peace about leaving you, and I'm going to stay. And I was able to go back to my job, and began to discover more in depth the things of the Lord, and specifically the things of the Spirit, which was kind of ignored pretty much in our fellowship, and began to embrace those, and life began to take off. Fast forwarding to about 2009, we had been working with a church plant, and our church plant eventually came to an end, and we were looking for another place to go, and we just really didn't have anywhere to go. We knew going back to our old church wasn't the answer. And just kind of almost on a whim, it seemed like at the time, we went to Restoration Church, is what we called it at the time. A place that we had gone to a few nights of worship several years before. Had to look it up and find out if it was still there. But we walked in, and it was like the Lord just opened the door himself and said, okay, you're home. And the Lord took hold of me and my heart and just turned up the bandwidth on what I could hear from him. And things, like I said, just started to take off. Our minister got me hooked up with a men's group. And when you've grown up in church, you've been parts of men's groups, and everybody promises to be undying best buddies and relationship partners and everything, and that lasts about 2 weeks and it goes down. But this was real. The people there were real, and the Lord was there in the middle of them. And things began to happen. I remember one morning getting up. I was getting ready to go to some football games on Labor Day with some buddies, and the Lord spoke to me. And he speaks to you in a way you can understand. And he spoke to me and he said, Jeff, it's fixing to get good. And 2 nights later, I was in that men's group. And through Alan Tolles, the Lord began to minister to my heart in a way that I had never been touched before. And he showed himself to me, and he began to touch me and heal me. And I remember sitting in that men's group a year or two later and listening to a man talk about God's touch on his life and the fire of God coming out of him. And I asked him, as much as you can, describe that fire of God to me. He was talking about the Holy Spirit. And a brother there named Bill Bernardi, wonderful brother, Bill asked me, Jeff, have you ever been baptized in the Holy Spirit? And I said, I'm pretty sure I haven't, Bill. And so Bill prayed for me. Bill gathered around and prayed for me. All the other brothers prayed for me to receive the Holy Spirit. I didn't have any great manifestation like a lot of people have when they receive the Spirit. Sometimes when you receive the Spirit, all you get is a changed life. And so I wasn't sure if anything had happened for a day or two, but then I did begin to realize I am different in the world. I'm different in how the Lord functions through me. And so That's just the story of my life and what I said at City Life this morning. And the praise goes to God. It happened to me and through me, but the praise is God's.